Well, welcome back. As you can see, it's very, very dangerous. When people forget the truth and start to believe things that people say are true when they're not. How could Aslan and Tash be the same? Chapter 4. What happened that night? The king was so dizzy from being knocked down that he hardly knew what was happening until the Calormens untied his wrists and put his arms straight down by his sides and set him with his back against an ash tree. Then they bound ropes around his ankles and his knees and his waist and his chest and left him there. What worried him worst at the moment, for it is often little things that are hardest to stand, was that his lip was bleeding where they had hit him, and he couldn't wipe the little trickle of blood away, although it tickled him. From where he was, he could still see the little stable at the top of the hill and the ape standing in front of it. He could just hear the ape's voice still going on, and every now and then some answer from the crowd, but he could not make out the words. I wonder what they've done to Jewel, thought the king. Presently the crowd of beasts broke up and began going away in different directions. Some passed close to Tirian. They looked at him as if they were both frightened and sorry to see him tied up, but none of them spoke. Soon they had all gone, and there was silence in the wood. Then hours and hours went past, and Tirian became first very thirsty and then very hungry. As the afternoon dragged on and turned into evening, he became cold too. His back was very sore. The sun went down, and it began to be twilight. When it was almost dark, Tirian heard a light pitter-patter of feet and saw some small creatures coming toward him. The three on the left were mice, and there was a rabbit in the middle, and on the right were two moles. Both of these were carrying little bags on their back, which gave them a curious look in the dark, so that at first he wondered what kind of beasts they were. Then in a moment they were all standing up on their hind legs, laying their cool paws on his knees, and giving his knees snuffly animal kisses. They could reach his knees because Narnian talking beasts of that sort are bigger than the dumb beasts of that same kind in England. Lord King, dear Lord King, said their shrill little voices, we are so sorry for you. We daren't untie you because Aslan might be angry with us, but we've brought you your supper. At once the first mouse climbed nimbly up till he was perched on the rope that bound Tirian's chest, and was wrinkling its blunt nose in front of Tirian's face. Then the second mouse climbed up and hung on it just below the first mouse. The other beasts stood on the ground and began handing things up. Drink, sire, and then you'll find you'll be able to eat, said the topmost mouse. And Tirian found a little wooden bowl had been held to his lips. It was only the size of an egg cup, so that he had hardly tasted the wine before it was empty. But when the mouse passed it down, and the others refilled it and passed it again, and Tirian emptied it a second time. In this way they went on till he'd had quite a good drink, which was all the better for coming in little doses, for that was more thirst-quenching than one long draught. Here is cheese, sire, said the first mouse, but not very much, for fear it would make you too thirsty. And after the cheese they fed him with oat cakes and fresh butter, and then some more wine. Now hand up the water, said the first mouse, and I'll wash the king's face. There's blood on it. Then Tirian felt something like a tiny sponge dabbing his face, and it was most refreshing. Little friends, said Tirian, how can I thank you for all of this? You needn't, said the little voices. What else could we do? We don't have any other king. We're your people. If it was only the ape and the Calormens who were against you, we would have fought till we were cut to pieces before we let them tie you up. We would indeed. But we can't go against Aslan. Do you really think it's Aslan? Asked the king. Oh, yes, said the rabbit. He came out of the stable last night. We all saw him. What was he like? Said the king. Like a terrible great lion, to be sure, said one of the mice. And you think it is really Aslan who's killing the wood nymphs and making you all slaves to the king of Calormen? Oh, that's bad, isn't it? said the second mouse. "It would have been better if we'd died before this all began. But there's no doubt about it. Everyone says it's all Aslan's orders, and we've seen him. We didn't think Aslan would be like that. Why, we wanted him to come back to Narnia." "He seems to have come back very angry this time," said the first mouse. "We must all have done something dreadfully wrong without knowing it. He must be punishing us for something. But I do think we might be told what it was." "I suppose what we're doing now may be wrong," said the rabbit. "I don't care if it is," said one of the moles. "I'd do it again." But the others said, "Oh, hush, and do be careful." And then they all said, "We're sorry, dear king, but we must go now. It would never do for us to be caught here." "Leave me at once, dear beasts," said Tirian. I would not for all of Narnia bring any of you into danger." Good night, said the beasts, rubbing their noses against his knees. "We'll come back if we can." Then they all pattered away, and the wood seemed darker and colder and lonelier than it had before they came. The stars came out, and time went slowly on. Imagine how slowly. While that last king of Narnia stood stiff and sore and upright against the tree in his bonds. But at last, something happened. Far away there appeared a red light. Then it disappeared for a moment. Then it came back again, bigger and stronger. Then he could see dark shapes going to and fro on the side of the light and carrying bundles and throwing them down. He knew now what he was looking at. It was a bonfire, newly lit, and people were throwing bundles of brushwood on it. Presently it blazed up, and Tirian could see that it was on the very top of the hill. He could see quite clearly the stable behind it, all lit up in the red glow, and the great crowd of beasts and men between the fire and himself. A small figure, hunched up beside the fire, must have been the ape. It was saying something to the crowd, but he could not hear what. Then it went and bowed 3 times to the ground in front of the door of the stable. Then it got up and opened the door, and something on 4 legs, something that walked rather stiffly, came out of the stable and stood facing the crowd. A great wailing and howling went up, so loud that Tirian could hear some of the words. "Aslan, Aslan, Aslan," cried the beasts. "Speak to us. Comfort us. Be angry with us no more." From where Tirian was, he could not make out very clearly what the thing was, but he could see that it was yellow and hairy. He had never seen the great lion. He had never seen a common lion. He couldn't be sure that what he saw was not the real Aslan. He had not expected Aslan to look like that stiff thing which stood and said nothing. But how could one be sure? For a moment, horrible thoughts went through his mind. Then he remembered that nonsense about Tash and Aslan being the same, and he knew that the whole thing must be a cheat. The ape put his head close up to the yellow thing's head as if it were listening to something it was whispering to him. Then he turned and spoke to the crowd, and the crowd wailed again. Then the yellow thing turned clumsily round and walked, you might say waddled, back into the stable, and the ape shut the door behind it. After that, the fire must have been put out, for the light vanished quite quickly, and Tirian was once more alone in the cold and the darkness. He thought of other kings who had lived and died in Narnia in old times, and it seemed to him that none of them had ever been so unlucky as himself. He thought of his great-grandfather's great-grandfather, King Rilian, who had been stolen away by a witch when he was only a young prince and kept hidden for years in dark caves beneath the land of the northern giants. But then it had all come out right in the end, for 2 mysterious children had suddenly appeared from the land beyond the world's end and had rescued him, so that he came home to Narnia and had a long and prosperous reign. "It's not like that with me," said Tirian to himself. Then he went further back and thought about Rilian's father, Caspian the seafarer, whose wicked uncle King Miraz had tried to murder him, and how Caspian had fled into the woods and lived among the dwarfs. But that story, too, had all come out right in the end, for Caspian also had been helped by children. Only there were 4 of them that time, who came from somewhere beyond the world and fought a great battle and set him on his father's throne. But it was so long ago, said Tirian to himself. That sort of thing doesn't happen now. And then he remembered, for he had always been good at history when he was a boy, how those same 4 children who had helped Caspian had been in Narnia over 1,000 years before, And it was then that they had done the most remarkable thing of all. For then they had defeated the terrible White Witch and ended the 100 years of winter. And after that they reigned, all four of them together, at Cair Paravel, till they were no longer children, but great kings and lovely queens. And their reign had been the golden age of Narnia. And Aslan had come into that story a lot. He had come into all the other stories too, as Tirian now remembered. Aslan and the children from another world, thought Tirian. They have always come in when things were at their worst. Oh, if only they would come now. And he cried out, Aslan, 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 come and help us now. But in the darkness and in the cold and in the quietness went on just the same. Let me be killed, cried the king. I ask nothing for myself, but come and save all Narnia. And still there was no change in the night or the wood. But there began to be a kind of change inside Tirian. Without knowing why, he began to feel a faint hope. And he felt somehow stronger. Oh, Aslan, Aslan, he whispered, if you will not come yourself, at least send me the helpers from beyond the world, or let me call them. Let my voice carry beyond the world. And hardly knowing what he was doing, he suddenly cried out in a great voice, Children, children, friends of Narnia, quick, come to me. Across the worlds I call you. I, Tirian, the king of Narnia, the lord of Cair Paravel, and the emperor of the Lone Islands. And immediately he was plunged into a dream, if it was a dream, more vivid than any he had ever had in his life. He seemed to be standing in a lighted room where 7 people sat round a table. It looked as if they had finished their meal. 2 of these people were very old, an old man with a white beard and an old woman with wise, merry, twinkling eyes. He who sat at the right hand of the old man was hardly full grown, certainly younger than Tirian himself, but his face was already had the look of a king and a warrior. And you could almost say the same of the other youth who sat at the right hand of the old woman. Facing Tirian across the table was a fair-haired girl younger than any of these, and on her side a boy and a girl who were still younger. They were all dressed in what seemed to Tirian to be the oddest kind of clothes. But he had no time to think about the details like that, for instantly the youngest boy and both girls started to their feet, and one of them gave a little scream. The old woman stared and drew in her breath sharply. The old man must have made some sudden movement too, for the wine glass which stood at his right hand was swept off the table. Tirian could hear the tinkling noise as it broke on the floor. Then Tirian realized that those people could see him. They were staring at him as if they saw a ghost. But he noticed that the king-like one who sat at the old man's right never moved, though he turned pale, except that he clenched his right hand very tight. Then he said, Speak, if you are not a phantom or a dream. You have a Narnian look about you, and we are the 7 friends of Narnia. Tirian was longing to speak, and he tried to cry out aloud that he was Tirian of Narnia, but in great need of help. But he found, as I have sometimes found in dreams too, that his voice made no noise at all. The one who had already spoken to him rose to his feet. Shadow or spirit, or whatever you are, he said, fixing his eyes full on Tirian. If you are from Narnia, I charge you in the name of Aslan, speak to me. I am Peter, the High King. The room began to swim before Tirian's eyes. He heard the voices of those 7 people speaking all at once, and all getting fainter every second. And then they were all saying things like, Look, it's fading. It's melting away. It's vanishing. Next moment he was wide awake, still tied to the tree, colder and stiffer than ever. The wood was full of the pale, dreary light that comes before sunrise, and he was soaking wet with dew. It was nearly morning. That waking was about the worst moment he had ever had in his life. That's the end of chapter 4. Well, have a good rest, and tomorrow we'll see what help comes to the king. Have a good night.